Sometimes the scariest stories aren't about crime scenes or missing persons. Sometimes they're right there in your refrigerator. Every generation is shaped by something they're told is normal. A glass of milk on the table, a smile on a celebrity's face, a slogan you've heard since childhood. But what if that normal was manufactured? What if behind the creamy whiteness, behind the school lunches and the milk mustaches, there was something darker? This isn't just a story about milk, it's about power. About how something as simple as a drink was turned into an empire protected by billion-dollar marketing, political influence, government bailouts, and a deeply embedded lie we were all taught to believe. And it's not just in the past, it's still happening. So if you've ever asked yourself, why does milk feel like something I was supposed to drink even when my body said otherwise, you're not alone. This is the story of how milk became untouchable and what it took to finally question the glass we were all handed. Welcome to True Crime Echoes. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Why does no one talk about this? You ever have one of those weird little thoughts that won't leave you alone? That happened to me the other day. I was scrolling through my phone, half watching some viral cottage cheese recipe that somehow got 6 million views, and I suddenly thought, wait a second. Dairy. We're always talking about dairy. It's either the next health food craze or the devil's drink, depending on the year, right? But here's the weird part. When was the last time you heard of a dairy company going bankrupt? I mean, really think about it. We hear all the time about bookstores closing, family farms disappearing, even huge tech companies laying people off. But big dairy, they're just there. Always have been, always will be, quietly powerful, consistently stocked, always funded. Doesn't that strike you as a little strange? So I started digging. And what I found wasn't just strange, it was unnerving. Turns out the dairy industry doesn't just survive economic collapse, global shifts in eating habits, or new science that challenges everything we've been taught about milk. No, it thrives. And the reason for that? Well, it's not just good marketing. It's not even about calcium or bones or whatever your gym teacher said back in the 4th grade. The truth goes much deeper than that. I know this sounds dramatic, but just stay with me. Because what I discovered was something no one ever taught us in school. It turns out that for over a century, dairy has had a secret partner, a powerful one that makes sure it never fails no matter how bad things get. And that partner is the US government. Yeah, I didn't believe it either, but the more I looked, the more it all started to make sense. From royalty in powdered wigs sipping fresh milk in crystal goblets, to moldy underground cheese caves hidden below Missouri, to fast food menus stuffed with enough cheese to stop your heart, this story. It's wild, it's infuriating, and in a weird way, it's kind of hilarious. We've been drinking milk for so long, most of us don't even question it. I mean, think about it. It's totally normal in our culture to drink breast milk from an entirely different species, but only if that species is a cow. Anything else, disgusting, uncivilized, wrong. And yet somehow we were convinced that milk is essential to our survival. That wasn't an accident. It was a campaign, a very, very successful one. And what's even more disturbing, for some people, drinking milk turned deadly. And I don't just mean lactose intolerance or stomach aches, I mean actual death. Babies dying by the thousands, a citywide scandal, and nobody went to jail. The industry moved on. The milk kept flowing. So today, I want to take you back, way back. Back to when milk wasn't something you picked up in a plastic jug at the grocery store. Back when it was a risky luxury, something dirty, unregulated, even feared. I want to show you how it became sacred, how it became American. And then I want to show you how that idea, once planted, grew into something almost unstoppable. Because the story of dairy isn't just about food, it's about politics, power, propaganda. It's about how something as simple as a glass of milk became a symbol of health nationalism and economic control. And once you see the full picture, you might never look at your morning latte the same way again. So, are you ready? Let's begin. Chapter 2. Milk wasn't always innocent. When I was growing up, I was told that milk was a basic human need, like water, like air. Drink your milk or your bones will break, they said. I can still hear it. School lunch trays always had a carton chocolate if you were lucky. and every cereal commercial ended with a smiling kid gulping down milk like it was holy water. But here's what they didn't tell us. For most of human history, milk wasn't normal. It wasn't trusted. In fact, in many cultures, it was seen as unclean, taboo, even dangerous. Let me take you to Japan, a few hundred years ago, before there were convenience stores and vending machines on every corner. Back then, if you were seen drinking milk, people believed the gods would literally punish you. It wasn't just frowned upon, it was considered spiritually wrong. They didn't even call it milk, they called it white blood. Think about that. Not food, not nourishment, blood. And honestly, I kind of get it. Because here's something wild: most humans are born with the ability to digest milk. But we lose it. We're only supposed to process lactose milk sugar when we're babies drinking from our own mothers. But as we grow up, most of us actually become lactose intolerant. That's the biological default. So if you've ever felt bloated sick or just plain wrong after eating cheese or drinking a milkshake, you're not broken. You're normal. You're literally built that way. And if you don't have any issues with dairy, well, congratulations, you're basically a mutant, a super evolved outlier of the human species. Lucky you. Now here's the twist. There's a reason some people, especially people of Northern European descent, can tolerate milk well into adulthood. And it's not magic. It's not divine intervention. It's evolution. A long time ago, during a brutal period of food scarcity, some small communities in Europe had to get creative to survive. Crops were failing, winters were harsh, and the only reliable food source was livestock, specifically milk. The people who could digest milk survived, the ones who couldn't didn't. So over generations, those communities passed down the genes that allowed adults to process lactose. It became a survival trait, and then slowly a cultural one. That's how it started, not with doctors or nutritionists, but with desperation. What's fascinating and honestly kind of disturbing is how that one trait in one region became a global standard. Western culture eventually spread across the world, and so did the assumption that milk equals health, that milk equals normal, even though biologically speaking it's anything but. And just like that, something that was once feared, avoided, even punished, became sacred. Milk became a symbol of purity, strength, civilization. But here's the part that keeps me up at night. If most humans were never meant to consume dairy, why did we start? And more importantly, who benefited from making us believe we should? Because belief is powerful. If you believe something is good for you, you don't question it. You drink it. You give it to your kids. You build entire industries around it. And eventually it becomes too big to fail. So now we're standing on a mountain of milk trying to figure out how we got here and whether we ever really needed to climb it in the first place. And trust me, this story only gets weirder from here. Chapter 3, The Queen and Her Cow Palace. Okay, so we've established that for most of human history, milk wasn't this pure, wholesome thing we now treat it as. It was weird. It was controversial. It was even feared. But all that started to change, thanks to one very rich, very pampered woman in France. Yes, I'm talking about Marie Antoinette. Now we all know her as the queen who supposedly said, "Let them eat cake before losing her head." Whether she actually said that or not is up for debate, but here's what we do know. Marie had a thing for fantasy. She was obsessed with playing pretend. While the French people were starving in the streets, Marie was off in her little fantasy village pretending to be a milkmaid. No, seriously. At her palace in Versailles, her husband, the King of France, gave her a little luxury dairy farm as a gift. It wasn't just a barn with a few cows. No, this was a designer dairy. Think spa day for cows. The cows were bathed, brushed, perfumed. They drank cleaner water than most humans at the time. And they were milked into these dainty porcelain goblets shaped like breasts. I wish I were making that up. Marie Antoinette would dress up in a simple white gown, tie her hair back with a ribbon, and wander around this fake little farm like she was just a humble peasant milking cows, petting goats, living her whimsical cottagecore fantasy, all while the actual peasants were out there eating bark. But here's where it gets interesting. At that time, milk was still considered a poor person's food. It was accessible filling and didn't require fancy prep. The upper class looked down on it until they started noticing something. The peasants were strong. The working class had muscle. They were healthy. They could lift things. And meanwhile, the royals were walking around like delicate twigs with powdered wigs and corsets cutting off their circulation. Instead of realizing that maybe, just maybe, the peasants were strong because they worked hard all day, the aristocrats came to a different conclusion. They assumed it must be the milk. So in true rich people fashion, they decided to try it out. Milk became the new hot thing. If it gave peasants muscles, maybe it could give them strong ankles too. Marie led the charge. Her royal dairy wasn't just an indulgence, it became a trendsetter. And because she was who she was, whatever she did, the public followed. If the queen was drinking milk well, everyone wanted to drink milk. And just like that, milk got a makeover. It was no longer something for the poor. Now it was fashionable. It was elegant. It was a sign of status. Of course, the irony is, none of it worked. The royals didn't suddenly become buff. They didn't develop superhuman strength. But perception is everything. And once milk became popular with the elite, its image started to shift for good. This was the first time milk was marketed not as necessity, but as aspiration. And that shift, that rebranding, it would set the tone for everything that came after, especially in America. Because while France was sipping milk out of designer cups, the New World was about to take dairy to a whole new level. Not just as a fashion, but as a national identity. We're about to enter a period where milk wasn't just something you drank, it was something you believed in, something you were told to believe in, something you were proud of. And that pride, it came with a price. Chapter 4. Milk Patriotism and a Cup of Defiance. By now, milk had gone from something poor people drank out of necessity to something rich people sipped out of porcelain cups for vanity. And just when you thought it couldn't get weirder, America showed up. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, everything was about identity. Who were we now that we were no longer British? What did it mean to be American? And strangely enough, milk became part of the answer. Let me back up for a second. So you remember the Boston Tea Party, right? That high school history class moment we all barely remember because we were too busy doodling or silently panicking over pop quizzes. Basically, colonists were furious about taxes on imported tea from Britain. It became this huge symbolic thing, no taxation without representation, and it culminated in a bunch of angry men dumping crates of tea into Boston Harbor. And just like that, tea was out. It was British, it was elitist, it was the enemy. So what do you drink when you're no longer drinking tea, but you still want something hot, milky, and comforting in the morning milk? You drink milk. Patriots started promoting milk as the American beverage. It wasn't taxed. It came from your own land. It wasn't tied to a monarchy or some overseas empire. It was clean local and most importantly ours, and it didn't stop there. One of the most vocal advocates for this shift was Abigail Adams. Yes, that Abigail Adams, the future First Lady. She wasn't just sitting quietly in the background while her husband signed documents. No, she was speaking out, writing letters, telling Americans that if they truly wanted to be free from British influence, they needed to drink milk instead of tea. She literally said tea is a foreign luxury. Milk is patriotic. Think about that. In a country still figuring out what freedom meant, they decided that one of the most radical revolutionary things you could do was drink a glass of milk. And here's where the story takes another turn. As cities in America started to grow and industrialize, people began leaving farms behind. That meant fewer cows, less fresh milk, and a growing demand in urban areas. And with that demand came opportunity business production money. Milk wasn't just a drink anymore, it was a product, a commodity. And now it had a national purpose. Milk had become a symbol of health, of virtue, of independence. It was pure. It was American. It was profitable. But as demand increased and supply chains got more complicated, something happened. The very thing that had been declared patriotic, clean, and sacred was about to become contaminated, literally. And when that happened, people got sick. People died. And suddenly this pure white liquid wasn't so innocent anymore. But here's the thing about belief, it's stubborn. When a symbol is deeply tied to national identity, people don't question it easily, even when it turns deadly. And that's exactly what happened next. Chapter 5: The Milk That Killed Thousands. It's strange, isn't it? How something can start out as a symbol of purity, strength, and national pride, and somehow become poison. But that's exactly what happened with milk in 19th century America. And when I say poison, I'm not being dramatic. This part of the story isn't about rumors or conspiracies. This is real. This is death on a scale that's hard to even imagine. And worst of all, it was preventable. Let me set the scene. It's the mid-1800s. Cities like New York are growing fast. People are leaving farms, moving into cramped apartments, chasing work and a better life. But there's a problem: no more cows. In rural areas, families had their own cows. Fresh milk was part of daily life. But now in the city, fresh milk is hard to come by, and people miss their milk. Remember, by this point, milk isn't just a food, it's practically medicine, especially for babies and children. People believe it makes them strong, healthy American. But how do you get milk into a city without refrigeration, without clean transportation, without cows? Well, you get creative, and by creative I mean horrifying. City entrepreneurs started building makeshift dairies inside the city limits. That way milk didn't have to travel far. Sounds like a smart fix, right? Wrong. These urban dairies didn't have grass or pasture land for the cows, so instead they fed the cows something called swill, the leftover mash from nearby distilleries. It was hot, wet, fermented waste. It smelled, it was filthy, it had zero nutritional value, and it was the only thing these cows were eating. Now you don't need a degree in veterinary science to know that if you feed a cow garbage, you get garbage milk. The cows were sick, like visibly sick. They were cramped in dark stalls, standing in their own filth, too weak to walk. Many developed open sores. Some went blind. And their milk, it was blue. Blue, watery, disgusting, and completely unsellable. But the thing about money is it doesn't care about color. The swill milk producers started doctoring the milk to make it look normal. They'd add chalk or plaster of Paris to make it white. They'd thicken it with starch. Some even added molasses and eggs to give it that creamy color and texture. It looked like milk. But it was anything but. And here's the part that makes me sick. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't ignorance. This was calculated fraud. They knew this milk was bad. They knew it was making people sick. But they kept selling it anyway. Why? Because it was cheap. Because the poor needed it. Because no one was paying attention. Until babies started dying. Thousands of them. In 1858, the New York Times reported that an estimated 8,000 infants died in 1 year from swill milk in New York City alone. Let that sink in. 8,000 babies. And still, no one went to jail. No one was held accountable. Instead, the milk sellers fought back. They claimed the deaths were from poor hygiene, bad parenting, dirty bottles, anything but the milk. And they had powerful friends, politicians, businessmen, people with too much at stake to let the truth get out. Meanwhile, grieving mothers buried their children and wondered what they did wrong. It was one of the first major public health scandals in American history, and it exposed a devastating truth: even something as pure as milk can be weaponized when profit comes first. But the people weren't stupid. They saw what was happening. They started asking questions, protesting, demanding answers. And for the first time, the public's trust in milk, this sacred national symbol, began to crack. Because once milk became dangerous, the myth started to die. But as you're about to see, powerful myths don't go down easy, especially when they're backed by the church, the government, and an entire economy. And that's where we're headed next. Chapter 6: The Man Who Made Milk. Holy. After the swill milk scandal, something shifted in the American psyche. People were scared, rightfully so. The one thing they thought they could trust, the one thing they gave their babies, had become a silent killer. Milk, once a symbol of purity and pride, had turned into a public health threat. And for a while, it looked like milk might never recover. But then, out of nowhere, came a man with a Bible in one hand and a glass of milk in the other. His name was Robert Hartley. Now, I'll be honest. When I first read about Hartley, I thought he sounded intense. He wasn't a doctor or a scientist. He was a preacher, deeply religious, deeply moralistic. And he believed that the way you ate, the way you drank, the way you treated your body, that all of it was directly tied to your soul. And milk. To Hartley, milk was divine. He was part of the growing temperance movement, a social crusade against alcohol that was picking up steam in the early 1800s. Hartley believed that alcohol corrupted the body and the soul, and that only through clean, wholesome living could people be saved. But after the swill milk crisis, he faced a new dilemma. Because if people couldn't trust milk, they'd turn to something else. And that something else was often alcohol. In Hartley's mind, this wasn't just a public health issue. This was a moral emergency. If milk lost its place in society, people would fall into sin addiction and spiritual ruin. So he set out to save milk. Not just by defending it, but by redeeming it. Hartley started writing pamphlets, books, letters, anything he could to convince the public that milk wasn't the problem. It was the industry that poisoned it, the greed, the shortcuts, the urban dairies and their rotting cows. He told people, if you want safe, godly milk, get it from the country. Get it from cows that graze in open fields, from farmers who care. He even coined the term country milk, a wholesome moral contrast to the dangerous swill of the cities. And people listened, because Hartley wasn't just preaching about dairy, he was preaching about redemption, about bringing milk back to its rightful place as the perfect food, a gift from God meant to nourish and purify. He even cited scripture. The Bible talks about the land of milk and honey, right to Hartley. That wasn't just poetic language. It was a divine endorsement. Milk was holy, and drinking it was practically a religious act. And here's where it gets strategic. Around the same time, America's railroad system was expanding rapidly. That meant fresh milk from rural farms could now be transported into the cities faster than ever before without spoiling. It was the perfect storm. Hartley had the moral message. The farmers had the product, and the railroads had the infrastructure. Together, they rebuilt the American faith in milk. But they didn't just restore milk's reputation, they elevated it. They made it righteous. Drinking milk became more than just a dietary choice. It became a sign of discipline, of virtue, of being clean inside and out. And in a weird way, it worked. By the 1860s, new milk laws were being passed in cities like New York. Swill dairies were shut down. Selling adulterated milk became a punishable crime. And the industry slowly started to rebuild itself this time, with purity as the selling point. But here's what haunts me. It wasn't science or justice that brought milk back from the brink. It was belief. One man's conviction, one man's idea that food could be sacred, that milk could cleanse not just the body, but the soul. And when you mix that kind of moral certainty with business, with politics, with culture, well, you don't just get a product. You get a system that would grow bigger, richer, and more powerful than anyone, maybe even Hartley himself, could have imagined. And like any system built on belief, it would become very, very hard to question. But we're going to question it anyway, because this next part, this is where milk stops being a spiritual thing and becomes a corporate empire. Chapter 7. Boiling the fear out of milk. You know what's strange? For all the preaching, pamphlets, and promises that milk was a gift from God, it still kept making people sick. Even after Robert Hartley's crusade, even after swill milk was banned in some cities and new dairy laws were passed, people were still dying from what was supposed to be the purest drink in America. Why? Because the real problem hadn't been solved yet. It wasn't just where the milk came from, it was what was in it. Let's rewind for a second. In the 1800s, there was no refrigeration, no standardized hygiene practices, no safety regulations like we have today. Milk was carried in open containers, exposed to dirt, flies, sewage, you name it. It spoiled fast. It curdled in the summer. And even when it looked fine, it was often full of deadly bacteria. Diseases like tuberculosis, typhoid, diphtheria, and scarlet fever were being transmitted through raw milk. Babies and young children were especially vulnerable. Parents thought they were feeding their kids' health, They were actually giving them a ticking time bomb. And here's the part that's hard to stomach. People knew. Doctors had been sounding the alarm. Public health officials were raising concerns. But dairy producers, they didn't want to hear it, because fixing the problem meant money, infrastructure, time, and accountability. So they resisted, denied, blamed the consumer. And then science stepped in. Enter Louis Pasteur. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because of something you probably learned in high school and immediately forgot: pasteurization. It's named after him. Pasteur discovered that heating liquids like wine or milk to a certain temperature for a specific amount of time killed off harmful bacteria without ruining the taste. It was a game changer. And yet, even after Pasteur's research spread, American dairy producers still didn't want to adopt it. Why? Because it meant admitting that milk, this symbol of strength, nationalism, and religious virtue, was actually dangerous in its natural state. That would have shattered the myth. So instead of embracing the science, many producers doubled down on the fantasy. They said pasteurization was unnecessary, that it weakened the milk, that raw milk was more natural and wholesome. Sound familiar? But public pressure was building. Too many people had buried their children. Too many doctors were speaking out. Too many headlines were exposing the truth. The milk wasn't just spoiled, it was lethal. Eventually, cities like New York began requiring pasteurization for all commercial milk. Slowly, other cities followed. And guess what? Infant mortality rates began to drop. Outbreaks of milk-borne diseases decreased. The numbers didn't lie. Pasteurization was working. And finally, the dairy industry had to adapt or be left behind. Now, on the surface, this feels like a victory. Science triumphed. Public health improved. Milk was safe again. But if you dig a little deeper, something more subtle happened. Pasteurization didn't just save lives, it saved the industry. It allowed the myth of milk to survive. It gave dairy producers a new way to market their product, not just as natural or godly, but now as scientifically sanitized. The white liquid that once killed babies was reborn as the safest, cleanest, most essential drink on the planet. They didn't have to rebuild trust from scratch, they just had to rebrand it. And the public, we bought it. We always do. Because when something is marketed as both sacred and scientific, how do you question it? That's the trap. And that trap laid the foundation for what came next. Because once milk was considered safe, it was time to make it mandatory. Chapter 8. Milk Schools and the Making of Believers. By the early 1900s, milk had been reborn. It had gone through a full redemption arc from deadly bacteria-ridden sludge in the city streets to scientifically purified nourishment. Pasteurization had done its job. The milk industry had cleaned up its act, at least on the surface. But behind the scenes, something even more strategic was happening. Because saving milk wasn't enough. Now they needed to secure it. Cement its place in everyday life. Make sure no future scandal or health concern could ever shake public trust again. And to do that, they didn't just change the product. They went for the minds of children. I know that sounds dramatic, but stay with me. The dairy industry realized something that all powerful systems eventually figure out. If you want long-term loyalty, you don't target adults. You target kids. You build belief early. You turn consumption into habit. And the best place to do that, school. So around 1915, the National Dairy Council was formed, a coalition of farmers, milk producers, and marketers with one goal: make milk a permanent part of American identity. And they didn't waste any time. They started going into schools, giving educational lectures about milk. But these weren't just nutrition lessons, they were full-on propaganda campaigns. Teachers were handed pre-written scripts. Posters were put up in classrooms. Kids were taught songs about how milk would make them big and strong. There were pamphlets, cartoons, even puppet shows in some places. You remember those food pyramid posters we all saw in health class? The ones where milk had its own special spot? Yeah, that wasn't neutral science, that was marketing. The message was clear: if you want to grow up healthy, smart, strong, and American, you drink milk, period. And the repetition worked. I remember being in elementary school, sitting in the cafeteria with my little milk carton, either plain or chocolate, and just accepting it as normal. I didn't question it. None of us did. It was just there every single day, like nap time or spelling tests. But, looking back, it feels eerie. Because it wasn't just encouragement, it was enforcement. By the 1920s and 30s, milk had become a required part of many public school lunch programs. In some districts, it was even mandated by law. If a school didn't serve milk, it could lose its funding. If a child didn't drink milk, parents were told they were neglecting their health. And it gets darker. The 4 glasses a day rule, that wasn't based on any scientific evidence. It came directly from the marketing department at the National Dairy Council. They literally made it up. And the government just went with it. No one stopped to ask, what if this kid is lactose intolerant? What if they're getting nutrition from other sources? What if they just don't want it? None of that mattered, because this wasn't about health, it was about market security. The dairy industry wasn't just selling a product anymore, they were creating a generation of believers. And once that belief took hold, it was nearly unshakable. Even today, how many of us still carry the assumption that milk is essential, that it's a non-negotiable part of growing up, that it builds strong bones, prevents disease, keeps us whole? Spoiler alert, a lot of those claims don't hold up. But we'll get into that later. For now, I just want to sit with the realization that something as innocent as school lunches was actually part of a long-term corporate strategy. That what we thought was education was actually indoctrination. And it worked so well the dairy industry didn't stop with schools. Because after convincing kids, they went after the rest of America. Chapter 9: Milk Muscles and Manufactured Strength. So by now, milk had conquered childhood. It was in every lunch tray. It was tied to patriotism, purity, and health. Kids were basically taught that growing up without milk was like growing up without a spine. But children were just the beginning, because as those kids got older, the dairy industry had another challenge. How do you make milk cool for adults? Especially men, the ones less likely to drink it once school was over, enter the athletes. Now, if you grew up in the US, you already know that athletes, especially male athletes, are treated like modern-day gods. They're fast, strong, unstoppable. And we worship them for it. Posters, cereal boxes, TV ads, everywhere you looked there, they were sweaty and smiling with biceps the size of your head. And Big Dairy wanted in on that. They realized something very simple, but very powerful. If they could convince Americans that milk made these athletes strong, then the rest of us would want to drink it too. It was brilliant marketing, completely fabricated. But brilliant. One of the first major figures they used was Walter Johnson, a legendary pitcher for the Washington Senators in the 1920s. Big guy, serious arms, the kind of man whose handshake probably felt like a car crash. He starred in early promotional films, silent ones, of course, where he showed off his body and credited milk for his strength. That was just the beginning. Over the years, more athletes followed. Runners, boxers, football players, Olympic champions, all holding a glass of milk, all saying some version of, "This is what fuels me," and people believed it. Because who wouldn't want to be faster, stronger, more powerful? But here's the thing. It wasn't true. Milk wasn't giving these men superhuman strength. Most of their physiques came from training genetics, and in some cases, let's just say enhanced methods. The milk was just a photo op, a branding tool, a symbol. And that symbol was carefully gendered. This wasn't about soft health or wellness or gentle nutrition. This was about masculinity, dominance. If milk made athletes powerful, then milk made you powerful. It was liquid strength. Bottled testosterone. The original protein shake. And for men who were insecure about their status or just wanted to belong, that message hit hard. The campaign eventually expanded beyond athletes. Dairy producers partnered with Wheaties, the famous breakfast cereal that built its brand on the backs of sports heroes. Wheaties boxes always featured an athlete, and always implied that milk was part of the formula. The logic was seamless: if you eat the cereal that champions eat, and you drink the milk they drink, maybe you'll become one too. It sounds silly now, but it worked. Sales skyrocketed. Milk became the go-to beverage, not just for kids, but for grown men who wanted to feel like warriors. And that's what fascinates me. Because this wasn't about taste, it wasn't about science, it was about identity. We weren't just drinking milk anymore. We were drinking an idea that our bodies, our worth, our masculinity could be validated by what was in our glass. And the dairy industry. They leaned into it hard, because once milk became associated with male strength, it became almost untouchable. Criticize milk, and you weren't just criticizing a drink, you were questioning manhood. That's how deep the manipulation went. And they weren't done, because once milk was linked to athletic success, it was time to link it to national security. But we'll get to that. Chapter 10: Daddy Government and the Dairy Deal. You know that feeling when you realize something's just too big to fail. That's what happened with milk. By the time the 1930s rolled around, milk wasn't just a beverage anymore. It was a national symbol, an economic engine, a public school staple, and thanks to years of clever marketing, it was practically a religion. And then, the Great Depression hit. Suddenly, everything collapsed. Businesses shuttered, families lost everything, and even milk, this seemingly invincible government-approved miracle drink, was in trouble. People couldn't afford it. Dairy farmers couldn't sell it. The system was cracking. And for the first time in decades, there was a very real possibility that the entire dairy industry might actually collapse. But the thing is, they didn't let it. While other sectors of the economy were left to suffer, the government stepped in for dairy. In 1933, under Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, the U.S. government made a quiet but powerful promise: if milk prices dropped too low, the government would buy the surplus. All of it. Let that sink in. The government, already in the middle of an unprecedented economic crisis, decided that milk was too important to fail. They agreed to bail it out no matter what. And from that moment on, milk wasn't just milk anymore. It was an investment. That agreement set off a chain reaction that still shapes our food system today. Dairy producers realized they had a guaranteed buyer whether or not the public actually wanted the product, which meant they could produce as much as they wanted without fear of financial ruin. Too much milk. No problem, Daddy Government would buy it. And once you know that, a lot of things start to make sense, like the sudden rise of processed dairy products, cheese, butter, powdered milk. These weren't just culinary innovations, they were storage solutions, ways to keep all that excess milk from spoiling. Cheese especially became the go-to option. It lasted longer. It was compact. And importantly, it gave the illusion of variety. A surplus of milk could suddenly become dozens of different products, each one with its own ad campaign, its own shelf in the store, its own role in the American diet. And the kicker, we the taxpayers were paying for it. We funded the subsidies, we covered the buyouts, we footed the bill for marketing campaigns designed to convince us that we needed more dairy in our lives. And if that sounds dramatic, it is. But it's also true, because once the government got involved, dairy became more than just an industry. It became a protected class, an institution, one that politicians didn't dare question because it meant jobs votes and economic stability. Even when science started raising red flags, even when public health data suggested that too much dairy wasn't actually that great for us, the government stayed silent. Because they weren't just endorsing milk anymore. They were invested in it, financially, politically, permanently. And this alliance between government and industry laid the foundation for one of the strangest parts of this whole story. Because when you produce more dairy than the population can consume, and when your solution is to keep making more anyway, you end up with a problem. Where do you put it all? The answer might surprise you, because in the next chapter we're heading underground. Chapter 11: The Secret Cheese Caves. You ever hear something that sounds like a joke, but then realize it's not? That was me when I first heard about the cheese caves. Yes, cheese caves. And not in some quaint European countryside with monks and wheels of Gouda slowly aging in a mountain cellar. No, I'm talking about underground bunkers beneath the American Midwest full of government-owned cheese. And here's the wildest part. It wasn't a secret. It was just never really explained. Let's rewind. By the late 1970s, the U.S. government had spent decades propping up the dairy industry. Every time milk prices dropped, they stepped in buying up all the surplus to keep the market stable. And at first they tried to distribute it. They turned milk into powdered milk butter and especially cheese. and they stored it everywhere. But the problem was, people weren't eating it fast enough, and the government couldn't just stop buying. That would have collapsed the market. So they did what they thought was logical. They kept collecting it, and storing it, and storing it, and storing it. Until by 1981, the United States was sitting on over 500 million pounds of processed cheese. Let me say that again, 500 million pounds of cheese. That's when they started putting it underground in massive limestone caves in Missouri and Kansas places that were cool, dry, and stable enough to preserve food for decades. They were originally designed for military storage and Cold War stockpiling, but suddenly, they became cheese vaults, massive echoing warehouses, endless rows of towering pallets, all filled with bright orange blocks of surplus American cheese owned not by Kraft, not by farmers, but by the federal government. And no one really knew what to do with it. Because here's the thing, this wasn't fancy cheese. It wasn't artisan. It was government cheese, industrial, shelf-stable, dense. The kind of product you could ship, store, freeze, or even drop from a truck and it'd still hold its shape. So the government made a decision. They started giving it away. In the early 80s, under President Reagan, they launched what became known as the Temporary Emergency Food Assistance Program. And part of that program included the mass distribution of government cheese to low-income families, food banks, schools, shelters, you name it. Millions of Americans grew up eating it. Some loved it, others hated it, but almost no one questioned where it came from or why we had it in the first place. And that's what gets me, because the cheese caves, they weren't about charity. They weren't about helping the hungry. They were the byproduct of a rigged system, a system where the government couldn't stop feeding the dairy machine even when demand disappeared. So they hid the evidence underground, literally. And while people were told this was about supporting farmers or feeding the poor, the truth was messier. This was about economic survival, about too much product, too little transparency, and too many powerful interests with too much to lose. The cheese caves became a metaphor, one we weren't supposed to see, a symbol of how deep the government had gotten into bed with big dairy, how far they'd go to protect an industry built on nostalgia, nationalism, and a whole lot of marketing. And the strangest part? They're still there. To this day, millions of pounds of government cheese remain in a cold storage, quiet aging, and mostly forgotten. A dairy time capsule under the soil of America. It sounds ridiculous, absurd. Like conspiracy theory meets cartoon. But it happened, and it's still happening. And that makes me wonder, what else have we accepted as normal just because it was packaged in patriotism? Because if cheese can be hidden in caves for decades, what other truths have we buried along the way? Chapter 12. Got Milk, the campaign that rewrote reality. If you were alive in the 90s or early 2000s, chances are you remember it. That black and white ad, the serious face, the famous person, sometimes an athlete, sometimes a movie star, staring dead into the camera, and that now iconic white streak under their lip. Got milk, 2 words, a milk mustache. And suddenly you're thinking about dairy in a way you never had before. I'll be honest, when I was a kid, I didn't even question it. The ads were everywhere. Billboards, magazine covers, school cafeterias, even the side of buses. And the people in them, total icons. Beyoncé, Britney Spears, David Beckham, Serena Williams, even Kermit the Frog. Everyone, it seemed, had milk. And if they did, then maybe you should too. That was the genius of the campaign. It didn't just tell you to drink milk, it told you everyone else already was. And if you weren't, well, you were missing out. But let's rewind a little. The Got Milk campaign launched in 1993, created by the ad agency Goodbye Silverstein and Partners for the California Milk Processor Board. It was never about convincing people that milk was delicious, because, let's be honest, it's not everyone's favorite. The genius of the campaign was that it focused on absence. You don't appreciate milk until it's gone. The very first commercial, a guy trying to answer a radio trivia question about Alexander Hamilton. He's got peanut butter in his mouth, he knows the answer, but he can't say it clearly because he's out of milk. That's it. Simple, funny, memorable. And it worked. Within a year, the campaign exploded nationwide. The Milk Processor Education Program MilkPEP partnered with the National Dairy Council, and together they launched the now famous Milk Mustache ads. These were everywhere. The message was clear: milk isn't just healthy, it's cool, it's sexy, it's necessary. But here's where it gets manipulative. Because all of this, the celebrities, the mustaches, the messaging, wasn't actually about health. It was about market recovery. See, by the early 90s, milk sales were plummeting. More people were turning to sodas, juices, or just skipping milk entirely. Lactose intolerance was finally getting more attention. Alternative milks like soy and rice were slowly making their way into stores. And the dairy industry, they were terrified, so they turned to what they'd always turned to: image. They didn't change the product, they didn't reform the industry, they didn't invest in better science or more ethical practices. They just doubled down on marketing, and for a while it worked. Milk sales stabilized, brand loyalty improved. And perhaps most importantly, the campaign buried the conversation about whether milk was even necessary for adult health. Because when you see your favorite celebrity with a milk mustache, you don't ask, is this backed by evidence? You just think, well, if they drink it, I probably should too. And that's what made the Got Milk campaign so dangerous. It wasn't just advertising, it was social engineering. It used shame, FOMO, peer pressure, celebrity worship. It reached into schools, households, gyms, magazines, and it told us that not drinking milk was somehow wrong, un-American, unhealthy, unattractive, even though none of that was actually true. In fact, by the 2000s, more and more studies were showing that milk didn't necessarily strengthen bones, prevent fractures, or offer unique health benefits that couldn't be found in other foods. For many people, especially communities of color, milk caused bloating, cramps, and long-term digestive issues. But those facts never made the ad. And when criticisms did come out, the industry fought back hard with counter-ads, lobbyists, and more celebrity endorsements. Because by then, milk wasn't just a drink. It was a belief system, a belief that had been marketed to us since we were kids. Reinforced in schools, praised by doctors, funded by the government, glamorized by celebrities, and all of it rooted in one question: got milk? Yeah, we got it. We got a carefully crafted illusion. We got decades of manipulation. And we got the message loud and clear. But now we have something else: questions. Because if milk wasn't everything they told us it was, what else have they been lying about? And that brings us to the final chapter. Because this story doesn't end in ads or schools or even in caves full of cheese. It ends at the dinner table with us. Chapter 13. The glass on the table, what we drink, what we're told, and what we choose. So here we are. After 13 chapters, after history and science and scandal and caves full of cheese, we've arrived at the end. And the funny thing is, this whole time we've been talking about milk. But the more I dug into this story, the more I realized it was never just about milk. It was about trust. Because for so long, milk sat on our tables like a quiet, unquestioned guest. It was in our cereal, in our school lunches, in our hospital trays, in our ads, in our language. The milk of human kindness. Don't cry over spilled milk. Milk does a body good. We never really asked how it got there, or who made sure it stayed. And that's what this story has always been about. From the swill milk deaths in 19th century New York to the moral crusades of Robert Hartley. From underground cheese caves to multi-million-dollar ad campaigns. From school children forced to drink it to celebrities paid to sell it. Milk wasn't just sold to us. It was installed, brick by brick, generation by generation, until it felt like truth. But when you really look at it, like really sit with it, you start to see the cracks. You see how corporations partnered with government agencies to turn excess into virtue. You see how entire communities, especially Black, Asian, and Indigenous populations, were ignored when they said milk made them sick. You see how nutrition guidelines were written not just by scientists, but by industry lobbyists with billion-dollar budgets. And you see how marketing didn't just tell us what to buy, it told us who we were supposed to be: strong, clean, patriotic, masculine, wholesome, good. And all of that was tied to what was in your glass. But maybe the most unsettling part of all this isn't what we were told. It's how easily we believed it. We drank milk not because we loved it, but because we thought we should. Because it was what healthy people drank. What good parents gave their kids. What strong men chugged after lifting weights. What school cafeterias handed out like gospel. And sure, some of us actually liked the taste. But that's not really the point. The point is we never really asked. We trusted the carton. Trusted the commercials. Trusted the systems that told us what was normal. And in doing so, we stopped listening to our bodies, to each other, to common sense. We assumed the glass on the table was good, because it had always been there. But the truth is more complicated, because now people are asking questions. Now people are reading labels, looking into history, talking about lactose intolerance, environmental impact, animal ethics, racial disparities in dietary guidelines. And slowly, quietly, people are choosing differently. Some are switching to plant-based alternatives. Some are cutting dairy altogether. Some are just pausing, thinking, deciding for themselves, maybe for the first time. And that, to me, is where the real story ends, not with a scandal or a slogan, but with a choice. Because we can't undo the past. We can't unspill the milk, but we can stop letting someone else pour it for us. So next time you sit down for breakfast and there's a glass on the table, take a moment, ask yourself, do I actually want this? Or have I just been told that I should? That question, simple as it is, might be the most radical thing of all, because once you start asking it, you don't stop. And maybe, just maybe, that's where real change begins. We've spent over an hour together uncovering what lies beneath one of the most trusted staples in American life. And what we've found isn't just about dairy. It's about the systems that feed us literally and figuratively. The ones that tell us who we are, what we need, and what's good for us. It's about manipulation, silence, compliance. But it's also about waking up. Because once you start questioning what's on your plate or in your glass, you start questioning everything. If this story resonated with you, share it. Start a conversation. Ask the uncomfortable questions. Because history doesn't change unless we look it in the eye. And if you're still holding that glass of milk, you don't have to finish it. You're allowed to set it down. Thank you for listening. This has been True Crime Echoes. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and never stop questioning what you're told.